fix the broken pieces, couldn't find the missing part, even though it hurts to stay alive. Won't let it go too far. I couldn't stop myself from crying. Wish I had someone to call. Every time I told them I'll be fine, I didn't know it at all. Try my best to close my eyes, find my way to paradise. Somewhere I'm still holding on to find myself again. Now I realize what's missing. I won't break behind. If you read the chapter to the end, we're gonna make it right. We're gonna make it right. We're gonna make it right. Try my best to close my eyes, find my way to paradise. Somewhere I'm still holding on, find myself again.
When you live with moderate to
So why is it so hard to let you go? To let you go. So why is it so hard to let you go? To let you go. So why is it so hard to let you go? Let you go. So why is it so hard to let you go?
After more than a decade of cranking out nearly annual Pokémon games, Game Freak has handed the keys of the latest remakes to a relatively unknown developer, ILCA. But even without Game Freak in the driver's seat, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl have come out as meticulously faithful modernizations of the originals in almost every respect. That means they lack the adventurous improvements prior remakes have often made. But fortunately, Diamond and Pearl were pretty darn good games to begin with. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl tell the familiar story of a kid going on an adventure to catalog monsters before accidentally becoming the strongest fighter in the region and taking down a death cult with weird hair. There are no earth-shattering surprises, and the remake Pokémon roster is kinda disappointingly limited to just those that were available in Diamond and Pearl back in the day. It turns out, though, that what the original Diamond and Pearl lack in modern complexity, they more than make up for in depth. The story takes its time, in a way the series has largely forgotten, sending you through personable little hamlets with smaller attractions, as well as long, winding routes full of trainer battles that will have your Pokémon before you reach the next story destination. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl seem meatier for it too, landing at around 40 hours if you're at least dabbling in everything you come across, and longer if you dig into its robust post-game content. Adventure's lengthy hikes are made more complex by the ways in which their design incorporates puzzle-solving HM moves like rock climb, surf, defog, and so forth. Did Diamond and Pearl have too many HMs? Oh, heavens yes. But the remake cleverly relegates these moves to the smart-like Poketch menu, rather than making you carry a Bidoof in your party at all times to kick rocks for you. It's enough to transform the original's many winding side paths from unrewarding chores to exciting little spelunks for treasure as you hike your way under, over, around, and through the Sinnoh region's centerpiece, Mount Corindon. ILCA's faithfulness to the original Diamond and Pearl extends to the original pair's weaknesses too, and nowhere does that commitment surface more conflicting emotions than in the roster of Pokémon you can build your team from. Diamond and Pearl have an utterly bizarre slate of monsters, skewed heavily toward a handful of types that make it challenging to assemble a balanced group without being railroaded into using a few specific staples. That's mostly still the case in the Brilliant and Shining versions. Even with the addition of new spots to find wild Pokémon and Underground, ILCA largely stuck to the original roster of monsters for the main story, with the rest unlocked in post-game. While Platinum's expanded roster is available for capture if you make enough visits to the Grand Underground and hunt long and hard enough, they don't appear on the surface, where most of the story takes place, and it can be tricky to sniff out the exact you want to balance your team. Meanwhile, above ground, every other Pokémon is a Geodude, and there still aren't enough fire types to properly counter the 100 or so Bronzor you'll inevitably have to fight. That said, there's admittedly something legitimately fun about trying to craft a team around type and roster limitations that the series has generally avoided since Pokémon X and Y. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl feel just slightly more difficult than other recent Pokémon games as a result, which could catch those used to the likes of Let's Go off guard. But this grizzled veteran enjoyed the genuine challenge of compiling a crew that would be curb stomped by the Elite Four the second I walked in. Despite their faithfulness, there are a handful of places where ILCA was able to put its own clear stamp on what Pokémon can be, albeit to mixed results. Its remixes of the original Diamond soundtrack are almost entirely forgettable, for example, and the tapping rhythm game mechanic added in Pokémon Super contests misses the delightful excess of the original's dress-up, dance, and performance phases. But ILCA shines in other areas. The Grand Underground now includes spacious rooms where wild Pokémon roam freely, and I could spend hours running around that maze. Its chibi art style is surprisingly good looking in action, as long as it isn't zooming in too close. And I loved the cheeky opening moments of trainers, in which characters faithfully strike the exact pose their original sprite used to take before throwing their Pokéball and resuming more natural movement. Sinnoh also looks quite nice in general, within the stylistic bounds ILCA set for itself, though I wish it had been a little less married to Reap and Pearl's repetitive trees and grass. Other elements, like the rippling water and detailed reflections elsewhere, are unlike anything I've seen in other Pokemon games and warranted a moment of admiration. A similar amount of care was put into the diverse and detailed battle backdrops, which feel especially poignant given the many fights that took place in White Voids and Sword and Shield. Combine those with other thoughtful touches, like having
It's not really a controversial statement that the quality of Pokemon games was at its absolute zenith back in the DS era. From Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, which kicked off the much beloved 4th generation of Pokemon, to Black 2 and White 2, which wrapped up an incredibly ambitious and inventive 5th generation, the most the series has seen to date, in fact. The DS games were Pokemon at its peak as far as game design chops go. And really, while there may be some who argue that the decline in quality for the games that came has been exaggerated depending on whom you choose to talk to, the existence of Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl is a resounding reminder of just how great these games could be back in the day, and how much of that brilliance, pun intended, was lost once they decided to transition to 3D spaces. In case it's not clear, Brilliant Diamond and are really great. Now, they owe most of this to the simple fact that they're incredibly straightforward and faithful to a fault one-to-one translations of the originals. But those 15-year-old originals still remain at the top of this series outing. So simply by bringing them over almost as is to the Switch, we end up with an entry that's far more remarkable, satisfying, and fulfilling than most of its other recent ones have been. The elevator pitch Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl is fairly straightforward. There are almost exactly one-to-one recreations of the original games, with no attempt to try and integrate them into the modern stylistic or design sensibilities the series has adopted since. This could sound like an incredibly unambitious undertaking, and it is, but it's also precisely what helps these new releases remain so much fun and engaging. You see, rather than making unnecessary changes to the pitch-perfect design of the original game, or trying to recreate them in the style of Sword and Shield, ILCA Incorporated, led by Game Freak, have simply opted to not mess with what works. Given that trying to recreate older games in newer styles has led to some pretty divisive mistakes in this series in the past, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are both really good modern takes on the classics they're based on, but they end up sacrificing a lot that people loved about those originals in the process. This ends up working out really well here. So we end up with Sinnoh, still the best map in the series, complete with an incredible amount of aesthetic and geographic variation brought over as is. And Sinnoh is an incredible map. It has everything: underground caverns, frozen and snowy tundras, marshes and swamps, forests, grasslands, deserts, coastal settings and beaches, mountains, small village tucked out of the way, giant urban centers that are the life in the region. It's a massive map, with a trip between any two destinations being extremely long, full of dense and massive routes, which make every time you step out feel like an actual journey and an actual adventure, something that, again, the modern games in this series lack. It's also designed to give the player a lot of agency. While Sinnoh is laid out with a lock and key design to channel players' progress along an end path, it also offers a lot to the player who's willing to step off the beaten path and go traipsing on their own, whether that be encounters with relatively rare wild Pokemon to entire areas and dungeons that are optional and hidden, just waiting for the enterprising player who might be willing to step off the road and follow the trail to where it leads. Sinnoh is an adventure and a great map and setting, and that Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl as is without trying to, I don't know, for example, recreate it in Sword and Shield's 3D style or as a wild area, works to these games' benefit. As of right now, it's very clear that Game Freak does not properly understand how to design compelling 3D spaces, but they've mastered the art of great design in 2D. So sticking to their best 2D maps to date, as is, rather than trying to rebuild it in 3D, was definitely a smart decision. In general, this means that Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl end up with almost all of the same merits that the original games had. They've got that great map, as I mentioned, and the great sense of progression and adventure it brings. They're also ridiculously full of content. The fourth generation Pokemon games were frankly absurd with just how much they had to offer to players. You had an extremely long mainline campaign, you had online trading and battles, you had an extremely fleshed out contest tournament you could lose dozens of hours to. You had massive mini games and meta progression frameworks, from the Underground, which hosted fossil hunting and spelunking for treasures, to poffin cooking. You had fairly expansive post-game with an entire new island that opened up once you beat the Elite Four. And as mentioned, you had entire dungeons that were totally optional, just lying there out of the way for players who bothered to go explore them, getting some pretty cool rewards. So it was a wicked encounter with a legendary. All of that is here, almost as is. There have been a few changes made, some for the better. The Underground is hugely expanded now, and it knows it because it's called the Grand Underground now, and plays host to everything it did in the originals, while also including caverns for encounters with higher level Pokemon, which can usually end up being stronger than the ones you find wild, and also end up including some rare Pokemon you can't find anywhere else. In a way, this helps address the issue of Pokemon availability in Sinnoh. Famously, for example, the Sinnoh Dex did not offer any fire-type Pokemon until you beat the Pokemon Pokemon League, unless you really liked Ponyta or Rapidash. That sort of gets addressed with the Grand Underground. Other changes are decidedly worse. For instance, contests in Diamond and Pearl were a step down from how perfect they had been in Ruby and Sapphire, which introduced them, but they were still really compelling. They've been totally ruined in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl to just being a rhythm minigame. I'm sure a lot of people may still enjoy them, but I personally definitely found them to be a step down from the originals.